Imagine standing on a small wooden boat in the freezing dark at 4 in the morning. Your legs are shaking, not from the cold, but from fear. In your hands is a rifle you were given only months ago. Around you, thousands of other young men, most of them barely 20 years old, are silently praying, some crying quietly, some simply staring at nothing. In a few minutes, the doors of this boat will drop open. And when they do, many of these men will not live to see the sun rise fully over the horizon. This is not a movie. This actually happened. On a single beach, on a single morning in June of 1944. This is the true, untold story of D-Day, the day that decided the fate of the entire world. Stay until the end because there's a secret behind this invasion that most people never learn. A lie so massive it may be the greatest deception in the history of warfare. Welcome back to Dustdream History, the channel where we dig up the stories that time tried to bury. If this is your first time here, we tell the darkest, most untold stories from world history, the moments that shaped the world we live in today, but that most people never truly understand. Today, we're going back to June 6, 1944. Grab something warm to drink, get comfortable, because this is a long one, and it deserves to be told properly. To understand D-Day, you first have to understand just how dark the world had become by the summer of 1944. For nearly 4 years, Adolf Hitler's armies had held almost the entirety of Western Europe in an iron grip. France had fallen in 1940, in just 6 weeks, a defeat so fast and so total that it stunned the entire world. Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, one by one, they had all fallen under Nazi occupation. Millions of people across Europe were living under constant fear. Curfews, checkpoints, neighbors disappearing in the night, never to be seen again. In France alone, a brutal secret police network hunted down resistance fighters, Jewish families, and anyone suspected of defying Nazi rule. Many of them were sent to concentration camps from which they would never return. Britain stood alone for most of this time, an island nation, bombed nightly during the Blitz, its cities reduced to rubble, its people surviving in underground shelters night after night. And on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was locked in one of the bloodiest struggles in human history against Germany, losing soldiers by the millions. By 1944, the United States had already been fighting in the war for over 2 years, following the attack on Pearl Harbor. American, British, and Canadian forces had slowly been gaining ground in North Africa, in Italy, but one enormous problem remained. Western Europe itself, France, Belgium, the very heart of Hitler's empire, was still firmly in Nazi hands. And every single military leader on the Allied side understood the same brutal truth. This war could not be won from the outskirts. To defeat Hitler, Allied forces would have to go directly into occupied Europe and fight their way through. That mission would require the largest, most complex, most dangerous military operation ever attempted in human history. It needed a name. They called it Operation Overlord. Here is something most people don't realize about D-Day. This was not simply a matter of loading soldiers onto boats and sending them across the sea. Planning this invasion took over a year, involved more than 1 million soldiers, and required a level of coordination that had genuinely never existed before in warfare. Allied commanders led by American General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an almost impossible set of problems. First, where to land. The coast of France was heavily fortified. Hitler had ordered the construction of what was called the Atlantic Wall, a chain of bunkers, landmines, barbed wire, and artillery positions stretching along thousands of miles of coastline, specifically designed to make an Allied invasion by sea nearly impossible. Second, timing. The invasion needed a very specific combination of tide, moonlight, and weather conditions that only occurred a few days each month. Get it wrong, and tens of thousands of soldiers could be slaughtered before they even reached the beach. Third, and perhaps most dangerous of all, secrecy. If Hitler's forces knew exactly where and when the invasion would happen, the Atlantic Wall's defenders could simply mass their forces at that single point and annihilate the invasion before it even had a chance to begin. This is where the story turns from military history into one of the greatest deception operations ever carried out in human history. Here's a question worth sitting with. How do you hide the largest invasion force in human history from an enemy who is actively watching every part of the coastline for exactly that? The answer Allied intelligence came up with was almost unbelievable in its audacity. They didn't just try to hide the invasion. They built an entire fake one. The operation was called Fortitude, and it remains, to this day, one of the most successful deception campaigns ever executed in warfare. Allied engineers constructed entire fake military camps, complete with inflatable rubber tanks, wooden aircraft, and fabricated supply depots, positioned in southeastern England, directly across the English Channel from Calais, France. From the air, through German reconnaissance photography, these fake camps looked completely real. They even invented an entire fictional army, supposedly commanded by one of America's most aggressive and respected generals. In reality, this army barely existed, just a skeleton of radio operators sending fake transmissions, describing troop movements, supply requests, and training exercises, none of which were actually happening. And then there were the double agents. British intelligence had, by this point in the war, managed to identify and either capture or turn nearly every single German spy operating in Britain. Instead of eliminating them, they used them, feeding them carefully crafted false information to send back to Berlin. One agent, a Spanish double agent, became so trusted by German intelligence that he was eventually awarded a medal by Hitler's own government, while secretly working entirely for the Allies the whole time. Because of this deception, German high command became convinced that the real invasion would land at Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, and the most obvious location for an attack. The actual target was nearly 200 miles away, a stretch of Normandy coastline that German intelligence considered far less likely. Here's what makes this deception even more remarkable. It didn't stop working after the invasion began. Even after Allied troops were already fighting on the beaches of Normandy, Hitler himself remained convinced for weeks that this was merely a diversion, and that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. Because of this, he refused to release his most powerful reserve forces, tank divisions that could have potentially crushed the invasion in its earliest, most vulnerable hours. So let me ask you this, what do you think is more remarkable, the bravery of the men who stormed those beaches, or the deception that gave them a fighting chance to survive it? I'd genuinely like to know your answer. Drop it in the comments, because we're about to go into what happened on the beaches themselves. By the evening of June 5, 1944, the plan was set in motion. Weather had delayed the invasion by a full day due to violent storms in the English Channel, but a brief window of slightly calmer conditions was forecast for the early hours of June 6. Eisenhower made the final call. The invasion would proceed. That night, over the coast of Normandy, more than 13,000 Allied paratroopers boarded transport planes in the darkness. Their mission was to drop behind enemy lines hours before the beach landings began, securing bridges, roads, and villages to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast in time. Many of these young men, some barely out of their teenage years, wrote letters that night to parents, wives, and girlfriends back home. Letters they knew might be the last thing their families would ever receive from them. At sea, an armada almost impossible to imagine gathered in the darkness. Nearly 7,000 ships, from massive battleships to small landing craft, carrying more than 130,000 soldiers who would land by sea in the hours ahead. It remains the largest naval invasion force ever assembled in human history. Many of these soldiers were seasick, exhausted, and terrified, crammed into small landing craft that tossed violently in the rough channel waters for hours before they even reached the shore. And on the German side of the coastline, many senior commanders had no idea what was coming. Weather reports had suggested conditions were too rough for any invasion attempt, so rough, in fact, that the commander of German forces in Normandy had actually left for Germany that very week to celebrate his wife's birthday, convinced no invasion could possibly happen in such weather. The stage was set, and as the first light of dawn began to creep over the English Channel on the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest military operation in human history was about to begin. The Allied invasion targeted 5 separate beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coastline, each given a code name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Utah Beach, American forces landed with relatively lighter resistance, managing to secure the beachhead within hours, aided by paratroopers who had already captured key positions further inland overnight. At Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, British and Canadian forces faced fierce fighting, but by the end of the day had also succeeded in pushing inland. But there is one beach that has come to symbolize the true, brutal cost of D-Day more than any other: Omaha Beach. Here, American soldiers faced the single deadliest stretch of coastline in the entire invasion. Steep bluffs overlooking the beach gave German defenders a clear, uninterrupted line of fire down onto the exposed sand below. Naval bombardment meant to destroy German defenses beforehand had largely missed its targets due to poor visibility. Many landing craft were struck by artillery before soldiers could even reach the shore. Others hit underwater obstacles and sank, drowning heavily equipped soldiers before they ever set foot on the beach at all. Survivors would later describe wading through water stained red, stepping over the bodies of friends who had been standing beside them only moments earlier. Entire units were wiped out within minutes of the landing craft doors opening. Some companies suffered casualty rates of over 60% in the very first hour alone. One soldier who survived Omaha Beach later described it simply as walking into a wall of fire with no way to walk around it. You could only walk through it, or you did not walk at all. By the end of that single day, nearly 2,400 American soldiers had been killed or wounded on Omaha Beach alone. And yet, despite the horror, despite the staggering losses, by nightfall on June 6th, Allied forces had done what many military experts had believed to be nearly impossible. They had broken through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. All 5 beaches, though not yet fully connected, were in Allied hands. The door into occupied Europe had been forced open. Behind every number in this story is a person, a name, a family, a life that was either saved or lost in a single moment on that beach. There were medics who ran directly into gunfire, unarmed, simply to drag wounded soldiers to safety. There were young men barely 18 years old who had never fired a weapon outside of training, now facing the deadliest hours of their entire lives. There were officers who, seeing their men freeze in fear on the open beach, stood up under direct fire and urged their men forward, telling them the beach itself was the most dangerous place they could possibly stay. Some of these men were brothers, fighting side by side, watching each other survive or not within feet of one another. Many soldiers who survived that day carried what they witnessed with them for the rest of their lives. In interviews decades later, elderly veterans would still pause, their voices breaking, unable to fully describe what they had seen on that beach as young men. This is why D-Day is remembered not simply as a military victory, but as one of the greatest acts of collective human courage ever recorded. Ordinary young men, many barely out of school, who knowingly walked into near-certain death because they believed the world on the other side of that beach was worth saving. In the days and weeks that followed, more than 2 million Allied soldiers, along with vehicles, supplies, and equipment, poured into Normandy through the beachheads secured on D-Day. The fighting through the French countryside that followed, known as the Battle of Normandy, was brutal and slow, fought village by village, hedge by hedge, through the dense farmland of the French countryside. It would take nearly 3 more months of intense fighting before Paris itself was finally liberated in August of 1944. But D-Day had done what it needed to do. It had opened a second major front against Nazi Germany in Western Europe, forcing Hitler's forces to fight a war on multiple sides simultaneously, in the east against the Soviet Union, and now in the west against the combined might of the United States, Britain, Canada, and their allies. Less than 11 months after that single, bloody morning on the beaches of Normandy, Nazi Germany would formally surrender, bringing the war in Europe to its end. Historians widely regard D-Day as one of the true turning points of the Second World War, the moment the tide decisively shifted and Hitler's empire began its final collapse. Now here's something most documentaries about D-Day never fully explore. We already told you about Operation Fortitude, the deception that convinced Hitler the real invasion would come at Calais. But what's genuinely remarkable is just how long that deception continued to work, even after the invasion had already begun. For nearly 7 full weeks after D-Day, Hitler continued to believe that Normandy might still be a diversion, and kept an entire powerful army, including elite tank divisions, held back near Calais, waiting for an invasion that was never coming. Some historians believe that if those forces had been released immediately on June 6th and thrown into Normandy in full force, the entire invasion could potentially have been crushed within days, fundamentally changing the outcome of the war. Which raises an uncomfortable question that historians still debate. Was the success of D-Day truly decided by the bravery of the soldiers on the beach, or was it, just as much, decided weeks earlier by spies, double agents, and a fake army that never fired a single real shot? Both things can be true at once, of course. The courage on that beach was real, and it was extraordinary. But the deception that made that courage matter, that gave those men a fighting chance at all, is a story that deserves to be remembered just as much. Today, the beaches of Normandy are quiet. Where soldiers once ran through gunfire, tourists now walk peacefully along the same sand. Rows of white crosses and stars of David stretch across the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, over 9,000 of them, marking the graves of soldiers who never went home. Every June 6th, survivors, now in their late 90s and older, their numbers growing smaller each year, still return to that same beach to honor the friends they lost as young men, so many decades ago. D-Day remains one of the most studied, most remembered days in modern history, not simply because of what it achieved militarily, but because of what it represented: ordinary people choosing extraordinary courage at the exact moment history demanded it of them. If this story moved you the way it moved me while putting it together, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Dustdream History brings you a new untold story from world history every single week, and this is exactly the kind of story we love to tell. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Where did you find this video? Was it recommended to you by YouTube? Did a friend send it to you? Or did you search for this story yourself? I'm genuinely curious how you ended up here today. Let me know in the comments below. And while you're there, what part of this story affected you the most? The deception that fooled Hitler for weeks? The soldiers who ran into gunfire to save their friends? Or something else entirely? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, this has been Dustdream History. Thank you for watching.